Welcome to History Wake. Tonight, we travel to the edge of possibility. Dim the lights, let the day slowly fade away. Find a warm, comfortable spot, a cozy bed, a quiet couch, or your favorite chair. Close your eyes if you like, and let your mind drift, softly, slowly, through shadows, stars, and questions that have puzzled generations. Tonight, we revisit one of the most iconic moments in human history. July 20th, 1969, when a man stepped onto lunar soil, or so we were told. Neil Armstrong's voice, carried on black and white broadcasts across the globe, declared, "That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind." But what if that moment was something else entirely? What if it was a carefully staged performance, crafted not in space, but on Earth? A Cold War production, a masterstroke of cinematic deception, a symbol of power, not progress. In this story, there are rockets, heroes, billion-dollar budgets, and doubts. Behind it all, a quiet tension between truth and illusion, belief and disbelief. The flickering image on a television screen and the vast silence of the lunar surface. Was it real? Was it partially real? Or was it the greatest sleight of hand ever pulled on a global audience? Tonight, we won't rush to conclusions or try to win a debate. We will wander slowly, gently, through the known and the mysterious. You'll hear about the Cold War space race and why the US needed a win. We'll explore how technology advanced rapidly, and how skeptics say it advanced too fast. We'll talk about camera angles, rocket science, astronauts, and even filmmaker Stanley Kubrick. And we'll listen patiently to both believers and doubters. In this space, you don't need to choose a side. Just relax, breathe, and drift gently through a story as vast as space and as soft as moonlight. This is not just a documentary, it's a space to let your thoughts slow down, to wonder, and perhaps to fall asleep under the stars of a question we still don't fully understand. So, settle in, and let's begin not with rockets, conspiracies, or famous quotes, but with a quiet moment and a whisper from the moon. Was it real, or was it a dream that never left the ground? Chapter 1. The space race begins. Before there were astronauts, before rocket fuel burned against the blue, there was fear and pride, and a world split in two. After World War II ended, a new kind of war began, not with bombs, not with invasions, but with ideas, and with space. The United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers locked in an invisible contest. Their weapons weren't just tanks and missiles, they were symbols, flags on maps, ideals spread through radio signals and newsreels. Democracy versus communism, capitalism versus control, East versus West. And above them, the sky, still untouched, still silent, still waiting. In 1957, that silence was broken. A metallic sphere, no larger than a beach ball, began orbiting Earth. It was called Sputnik, fellow traveler in Russian. Launched by the USSR, it was the first human-made object to escape gravity and circle the globe. It beeped, a simple sound, just radio pulses, but they echoed like thunder. To Americans, it felt like a loss. Suddenly, the sky no longer belonged to all of us. The Soviets had claimed it first. Then came Laika, the little dog who became the first living creature in orbit. And after that, Yuri Gagarin, a pilot, smiling in his helmet, who became the first man in space in April of 1961. His journey lasted just 108 minutes, but it shook the world. The Soviet Union had done what seemed impossible. Not once, but again and again. The United States was behind, and that wasn't just a scientific concern. It was political, psychological, cultural. How could the land of innovation, the land of freedom and progress, be second? President John F. Kennedy addressed Congress just a month after Gagarin's flight. He didn't propose catching up. He proposed something greater. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. It was bold, it was risky, and it had never been done. But it wasn't just about exploration. It was about winning. Because by then, space was no longer just a scientific frontier. It had become a battlefield of ideas. If the Soviets could launch satellites, they could launch weapons. If they could send men into orbit, they could send eyes to spy from above. And if they could reach the moon, they would stand taller on the world stage. For the US, beating the USSR to the moon became a symbolic necessity. Billions of dollars were poured into the effort. A brand new agency. NASA was tasked with making the impossible real. Engineers, mathematicians, scientists, and test pilots became national heroes overnight. But the early years were not easy. In 1967, tragedy struck. 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, died in a launch pad fire during a pre-flight test for Apollo 1. A spark, a flash, a sealed cabin full of oxygen, and suddenly the dream paused. But it didn't stop. Failure only increased the pressure. The United States had to deliver, not just for science, not just for exploration, but for the soul of a country, and a world watching. Behind the scenes, the Cold War burned hotter than ever. Espionage, threats of nuclear war, proxy battles from Cuba to Vietnam. Space offered something different, something cleaner, a way to prove power, without violence. But with each Soviet success, America's need for a symbolic win grew more urgent. And that pressure, that intense, relentless pressure would shape everything that followed. The rockets, the astronauts, the footage, the narrative, and for some, that pressure raises a question. If winning meant everything, how far would a government go? Would it take shortcuts? Would it hide the truth? Would it, just maybe, choose illusion over failure? Those are questions for later chapters, but for now, we stay in the moment. The late 1950s, the early 60s, the dawn of a race, not between nations, but between ideals, 2 sides, 2 visions, and 1 moon waiting in the distance. Up next, we'll look at NASA's bold response. The Apollo program. The rockets that were built, the tests that were run, the missions that risked everything, and whether by engineering or imagination, we truly reached the moon, or simply convinced ourselves we did. Chapter 2. Building Apollo, Science, Sacrifice, and Spectacle. In the quiet hum of the 1960s, as the world tilted further into Cold War tensions, a monumental project was unfolding, not in secret bunkers, but in open air, under the bright lights of a hopeful public eye. Its name was Apollo, a name borrowed from the Greek god who drove the chariot of the sun across the sky, a fitting metaphor for a nation hoping to place its footprint on the moon. Before Apollo could rise, it had to stand on something solid. That foundation was laid by Project Mercury, America's first manned space program. 6 astronauts, in single-seat capsules, launched into low Earth orbit. They didn't go far, but they proved something essential. Humans could survive in space. Then came Project Gemini, a stepping stone between Mercury and Apollo. With larger 2-man crews, Gemini missions rehearsed the ballet of spaceflight, docking, spacewalking, re-entry, the essentials that would be needed for any moon landing attempt. And behind each of these missions were thousands of minds. Engineers, scientists, pilots, mathematicians. Many of them were young, fresh from universities, hungry to achieve something greater than themselves. And yet they worked under immense pressure. The Soviets had a head start. The world was watching, and the deadline loomed like a clock on a bomb. Apollo was not just a spacecraft, it was an ecosystem. It involved 3 stages of rockets, multiple command modules, a lunar lander, and a launch infrastructure unlike anything ever created before. At the center of this massive effort stood one towering achievement: the Saturn V rocket. It remains to this day the most powerful machine humanity has ever built. Standing 363 feet tall, it was taller than the Statue of Liberty. Its engines could produce over 7.5 million pounds of thrust, enough to lift its massive weight into orbit and beyond. It was designed by Wernher von Braun, a German rocket scientist who once worked on the Nazi V2 program, a fact that remains a complex and controversial footnote in the story. Von Braun's Saturn V was a technical marvel. Each launch was a controlled explosion, orchestrated with precision far ahead of its time. Out of 13 Saturn V launchers, not one rocket failed to reach its destination. In a world where even modern rockets still sometimes fail, this track record would later raise questions. Questions we'll explore in later chapters. But, in its time, the Saturn V was a symbol of what was possible when money, minds, and motivation aligned. The Apollo program costs over $25 billion at the time, over $150 billion today. Entire cities of people were employed. Over 400,000 workers took part in some aspect of the program. Scientists, metal workers, seamstresses who hand-stitched the spacesuits. It was a national project, born of pride and promise. On January 27, 1967, during a routine pre-launch test, 3 astronauts sat strapped inside the Apollo 1 command module. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. They were testing communication systems. Not expecting danger, then a spark. Inside the sealed capsule, filled with pure oxygen, the spark became fire. In just 17 seconds, all 3 men were gone. The nation mourned. NASA reeled. How could the most advanced technology in history fail so catastrophically before it had even launched? Investigations followed. The Apollo spacecraft was redesigned. Safety became paramount. Delays were accepted. Visualized lessons were learned. But the tragedy had another effect. It added urgency, pressure, a quiet understanding that failure could be fatal in every way, politically, publicly, and personally. While engineers worked behind closed doors, the rest of the nation watched. Through glowing television screens, each launch was a televised event, each astronaut a celebrity. America needed heroes, and NASA provided them. Men like Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were transformed into legends before they ever touched the moon, and in their shadows stood backup crews, mission planners, computer operators, the silent army behind the spectacle. This media visibility had a curious side effect. It created a narrative, a story that was tightly scripted, visually controlled, and built to inspire. The countdown, the roaring engines, the slow-motion footage. It looked like a movie, and for many, it felt like one. Later, critics, including conspiracy theorists, would point to this media gloss as evidence of something staged, something too polished. Why were there no stars in the lunar sky? Why did the flag ripple? Why did shadows fall strangely? These are questions for later chapters. But even now, in the early years of Apollo, the balance between science and showmanship was clear. NASA needed public support. Congress needed votes. America needed a win. And Apollo became the canvas on which all those needs were painted. As we close this chapter, it's important to remember just how much was risked and how much was lost. Apollo was not just about rockets. It was about identity, about belief, about proving to the world and to ourselves that we were capable of the impossible. Whether the moon landing was authentic, partially fabricated, or entirely staged, is a question still debated. But what's beyond debate is this: the Apollo program remains one of the most complex, expensive, and awe-inspiring efforts in human history. Next, we'll look at the fateful day, July 20th, 1969. The day the world watched a grainy, black-and-white broadcast and heard the words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Or did we? In Chapter 3, we'll walk through the moon landing itself, step by step, broadcast by broadcast, frame by frame, and ask, was it real or perfectly rehearsed? Chapter 3. The Power of Television. Making history live. In the stillness of July 20th, 1969, televisions flickered in living rooms across the globe. Curtains drawn, families gathered, children sat cross-legged on floors, elderly eyes fixed on the glowing screen. Radios hummed, static buzzed, and then those words, "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." It was, according to the official record, the most watched live broadcast in human history at the time. Over 600 million people, nearly 1/5 of the planet, tuned in, from bustling cities to remote villages, from corporate boardrooms to jungle outposts. The world came together to watch a grainy, black-and-white image of a man stepping onto another world. To understand the power of that moment, we have to consider the role of television in the 1960s. TV wasn't just a medium. It was an institution, a new kind of story. By 1969, nearly every American home had a television. Networks competed not just for ratings, but for cultural dominance. News anchors were trusted like family members. Broadcasters could shape public sentiment with a tone of voice. And the moon landing was the greatest television event of all time. CBS, NBC, ABC, all dedicated continuous coverage. Reporters speculated. Diagrams were drawn. Experts were interviewed. It was a 24-hour media event, long before such things became common, and at the center of it all was a NASA-controlled feed. The only video source the public would ever see. There were no independent cameras on the moon. No journalists embedded with the astronauts. Everything the world witnessed came from NASA's own lens. Neil Armstrong's descent down the ladder was filmed with a specially mounted TV camera attached to the lunar module. The image was dark, grainy, and ghost-like, yet, in spite of the distance, despite the supposedly primitive 1960s technology, the broadcast came through. Remarkably smooth, viewers watched as Armstrong planted his boot on lunar soil and uttered the now iconic phrase, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Audio experts later pointed out that Armstrong may have omitted the word a small linguistic slip, or something more scripted. Some critics ask, why did the moment feel so rehearsed? How did Armstrong, in a moment of unparalleled pressure, deliver such a perfect line? Was it spontaneous genius, or a line written long before the flight? Armstrong himself would later claim the phrase came to him in the moment. Others close to the program suggest it had been decided upon days before. Regardless of origin, the effect was cinematic. It was perfect, too perfect. Some would say the television images were dim and murky, and yet they carried a strange beauty. Astronauts floated in slow motion. Shadows fell across the lunar surface in long, sharp lines. The American flag fluttered ever so slightly, though NASA insists this was the result of movement during planting, not wind. Still, skeptics noted strange visual inconsistencies. Why were there no stars in the sky? NASA's explanation: the camera's exposure settings were too short to capture the faint light of distant stars. Why did shadows in some images seem to point in different directions? NASA attributes this to uneven terrain and wide-angle distortion, and yet others argued the lighting looked like a film set. Shadows cast by studio lamps, not the sun. In particular, they pointed to the way objects appeared to be backlit, with no visible light source behind them. Could it be moonlight reflecting from the surface, or stage lighting designed to simulate it? Fueling the cinematic suspicion is the frequent mention of Stanley Kubrick, the legendary director of 2001, A Space Odyssey, released just a year before the moon landing. Kubrick's film portrayed a space environment so convincing, many viewers believed it had used real NASA footage. Its realism was unprecedented, so when the moon landing aired, and appeared visually similar in style, some wondered if Kubrick had been enlisted to help stage the broadcast. Did the moon landing look too much like a movie because it was, in part, directed like one? Another point of interest is how tightly controlled the entire operation was. Every frame of video, every transmission, every photograph, all came through NASA's hands first. There were no live media observers on the moon, no competing angles, no external verification. And perhaps most significantly, the original tapes of the live broadcast were lost. NASA later admitted that the original high-resolution telemetry data of the moonwalk was erased in the 1980s, taped over during a routine data shortage. This revelation baffled many. Why would an event of such historic magnitude not be preserved in pristine condition? Why were researchers later forced to rely on lower-quality network recordings? To conspiracy theorists, this was suspicious. To NASA, it was a simple case of outdated storage policies. Either way, the erasure of the original footage removed a potential avenue for independent analysis. The images that remain are iconic, but they are copies of copies, filtered through television screens and broadcast antennas. Despite the doubts, despite the decades of analysis, one thing is clear. Television made the moon landing real. It gave it texture, emotion, credibility. Without the broadcast, it would have been a line in the newspaper, a press release, a grainy photograph. Instead, it became a global shared experience. And that is the paradox. The very medium that made the moon landing so unforgettable also made it vulnerable to doubt. Could such a perfect moment have been engineered? Could it have been filmed elsewhere, then broadcast as if live? Or was it simply a triumph of technology, planning, and narrative control? For many, the moon landing became a kind of secular miracle. The moment we left Earth, the moment we reached the gods, the moment we proved our mastery over nature, and television was the altar. The image on the screen was sacred. Whether real or fabricated, it changed us. It altered how we saw ourselves, as earthlings, as explorers, as one species under a shared sky. In the next chapter, we'll go even deeper into the heart of the conspiracy. We'll examine the specific claims, the alleged inconsistencies, and the mysteries that refuse to fade. But for now, consider this. Television did more than show us a moon landing. It created a memory so powerful, it still divides belief. And perhaps that was its greatest trick of all. Chapter 4. The Kubrick Connection. Stanley Kubrick. A name whispered in the quiet corners of conspiracy. A name celebrated in cinema halls and studied in classrooms. But, in this story, His name is attached to something far stranger than movies, a suggestion that places him not behind a film camera, but behind one of the most iconic broadcasts in human history. Could one of the most visionary directors of all time have helped stage the moon landing? It sounds like a script in itself. And yet, the whispers haven't stopped for decades. Let's step into the shadows and explore this strange intersection of art, science fiction, and history. In 1968, the world saw something extraordinary. Stanley Kubrick's 2001. A Space Odyssey premiered in theaters across the globe. It was quiet, cerebral, visually majestic, but more importantly, it looked real. Audiences were stunned. Never before had space been portrayed with such authenticity. Spaceships glided in silence. Gravity was obeyed. Artificial intelligence whispered. And the moon. It was depicted with astonishing detail. Kubrick had done something no director before him had managed. He made the cold, vast silence of space. Kubrick's realism didn't come from digital effects. There were no computers to simulate spacecraft or planets. Instead, he used advanced techniques, many never before seen on screen. One of the most notable, front-screen projection. This method involved projecting high-resolution images onto a reflective background, lit in such a way that actors could move in front of it, with the illusion that they were inside that landscape. Desert scenes were filmed indoors. Moon-like terrain appeared in stunning clarity. The seamless integration of live action and projected background was cutting-edge, and, it's worth noting, it closely resembles some of the visuals later associated with the Apollo 11 broadcast. To skeptics, this was no coincidence. Kubrick had not just directed 2001. He had inadvertently created the perfect rehearsal. The conspiracy theory goes like this. NASA, aware of the technical and political risks of failing to land on the moon, approached Kubrick, already known for his meticulous nature and deep understanding of cinematic illusion. According to some versions of the story, Kubrick was offered access to military-grade cameras and unlimited resources to create the illusion of the moon landing, just in case. Others say he agreed only under pressure. Some even suggest he embedded secret confessions in his later film, The Shining. Released in 1980, The Shining is a psychological horror classic, but some viewers believe it's something else. Kubrick's veiled confession. They point to the young boy, Danny, wearing an Apollo 11 sweater in one scene. To others, the infamous room 237 is no random number. They argue it refers to the 237,000 miles between Earth and the Moon, though modern measurements actually round closer to 238,855 miles. Still, believers insist the symbolism is deliberate. They interpret the Overlook Hotel as a metaphor for a vast lie, and Jack Torrance's descent into madness as Kubrick's own guilt surfacing through metaphor. Is it a stretch? Maybe. But in the world of conspiracy, patterns are everything, and once you start seeing them, it's hard to unsee them. Stanley Kubrick was notoriously reclusive. He rarely gave interviews. He avoided public appearances. He didn't explain his work. To conspiracy theorists, this made him the perfect accomplice. No trail, no public commentary, just mystery. But here's the counterpoint. Kubrick's films were often deeply critical of institutions. Military, government, even space programs. Why would a man who questioned authority work to assist it? Why would an artist of such integrity lend himself to a deception of global magnitude? It's a contradiction many struggle to reconcile. Over the years, several trick videos have circulated online. One claimed to be a leaked deathbed confession by Kubrick himself, admitting to faking the moon landings, but the man in the footage was later identified as an actor. The The video was part of a mockumentary project, not real evidence. Others have shared supposed behind-the-scenes footage of a moon set with Kubrick directing astronauts. But again, the clips have been debunked or traced to fan projects. There is, to date, no concrete evidence linking Kubrick to the Apollo program, only suspicions, coincidences, and art that feels too perfect to ignore. Film experts, engineers, and cinematographers have weighed in. Most agree that while 2001 was groundbreaking, it doesn't mean Kubrick could have, or would have, faked a live moon landing. Filming zero gravity convincingly is still nearly impossible without parabolic flights or digital manipulation, neither of which existed in the 1960s. Then there's the question of lighting. The moon's surface is lit by a single light source, the sun, simulating this in a studio with accurate shadows, harsh contrasts, and no atmosphere would require immense expertise, and would likely still be detectable. Apollo footage contains dust plumes behaving as they would in a vacuum, boot prints holding their shape on fine regolith, reflections in astronaut visors consistent with the lunar module and terrain. These are hard to fake, especially with 1960s technology. Still, for some, the possibility lingers, because the most powerful illusions don't require proof. They just need belief. Whether you believe in the Kubrick theory or not, one thing is certain: he changed how we see space, and maybe, just maybe, how we saw the moon landing. His art shaped our expectations. His techniques pushed boundaries, and in doing so, he blurred the lines between truth and fiction. In many ways, the Kubrick conspiracy isn't really about him. It's about trust. Can we trust our eyes? Can we trust our screens? Can we trust institutions, even in their greatest triumphs? That's what makes the theory endure. Not because it's proven, but because it speaks to something deeper, the suspicion that what we see is not always what is. In the next chapter, we move from the man behind the camera to the alleged flaws within the footage itself, from shadows and missing stars to odd reflections and photographic impossibilities. Join us as we examine the evidence for fakery, and let the mystery lead where it will. Chapter 5. Scientific impossibilities or misunderstood facts. There is something haunting about silence on the moon. No wind, no air, just dust and shadows. But it's in this silence that some of the loudest doubts have taken root. What if the most compelling evidence that the moon landings were faked lies not in cinematic rumor or Cold War agendas, but in physics, light, and the strange dance of dust beneath an alien sky? This chapter is about the arguments and the answers, claims of impossibility, moments that don't seem to add up, and the simple, calm explanations that often get overlooked. Discovered in 1958, these belts are created by Earth's magnetic field, trapping charged solar particles. Wouldn't the belts have cooked them alive? But NASA and physicists explain it differently. So breathe in, let your mind rest, and let's explore the quiet realm between skepticism and science. The Van Allen belts remain real, but so does human ingenuity in navigating them. On Earth, yes, but lunar dust behaves differently. Moon dust, or regolith, is made of fine, jagged particles, sharp-edged and unweathered by wind or water. Encircling our planet are two vast bands of trapped radiation, known as the Van Allen belts. It's why boot prints held their shape so clearly, despite the absence of moisture. It's not what we're used to. But the moon is not Earth. Moreover, the spacecraft were shielded, not heavily, but adequately for the brief passage Radiation exposure was measured and documented. Were they edited out? Did NASA forget to include them? The real answer lies in photography. It's a fair question, and one NASA has addressed. The Space Shuttle program, and later the International Space Station, took focus. And going back to the moon is still a logistical and financial challenge. Not a technological impossibility, but new missions are coming. Artemis is already in development, and perhaps, soon, humans will walk the lunar surface again. The Apollo program relied on single-use technology, designed for a specific mission at a specific time. Much of it was dismantled after the program ended. Plans were lost. The moon's surface is brilliantly lit by the sun. Some objects seem lit from multiple sources. Wouldn't a single light? The sun cast shadows in only one direction. People don't question because they're foolish. They question because they care. They want the truth. They want to believe in greatness. But only if it's real. In an age of deep fakes and misinformation, skepticism is not the enemy of progress. It's a sign that minds are still active. To the very human hunger for myths, let's explore the why behind the Tao. Still seeking, and sometimes asking questions, even strange ones, helps us understand the answers more clearly. Yes. But perspective changes everything. The moon's uneven surface can bend and distort shadows. Slopes, dips, and ridges create optical illusions. Conspiracy theorists argue this proves tampering. But the explanation is simpler. Bright, reflective surfaces, like white suits or sunlit modules, can overexpose on film, washing out the faint crosshairs behind them. It's a quirk of photographic contrast, not Photoshop, especially considering that Photoshop didn't exist in 1969. Astronauts, landers, and the surrounding dust were all exposed to harsh light. Some skeptics argue, how could astronauts pass through this radiation without fatal exposure? And just like on Earth, when you use these settings in daylight, stars become invisible. They weren't removed. They were simply too dim to register. If you've ever tried stargazing in a bright city, you've seen this effect yourself, appearing to ripple as if moved by a breeze. But there is no wind on the moon, no air, no atmosphere. So what caused the movement? Professional photographers have studied these images extensively, and the results? They're consistent with natural lighting. Odd. Sometimes impossible. No. The Apollo spacecraft traveled through the thinnest part of the belts, and they did so quickly, limiting exposure. And while it existed, it was within survivable limits, far less than what patients receive during a full-bodied CT scan. And in the moon's vacuum, with no air resistance, those vibrations took longer to settle. What looked like wind was just momentum, moving freely in low gravity. It's strange, yes, but it's consistent with physics, not fakery. Perhaps no image stirred more suspicion than this one. The American flag. The answer lies in the flag's design. NASA engineers knew the flag would hang in a vacuum. So they added a horizontal rod across the top to hold it outward. When astronauts planted the flagpole, their twisting motion caused the fabric to vibrate. How did the astronauts leave such perfect footprints in dust? Wouldn't dry dust scatter? Wouldn't it collapse? This gives it a kind of stickiness, allowing it to compact well under pressure. A classic question. Why are there no stars in the moon landing photographs? To capture these subjects clearly, the cameras used fast shutter speeds and low exposure. Another often cited mystery involves the shadows in Apollo photos. Some appear to fall in different directions, and light can bounce off the bright lunar surface, adding fill illumination. Just like reflected sunlight on a snowy day, some photos show parts of the image obscuring the crosshairs or reticles, etched onto the camera lens, skeptics often wonder, if we had the technology to go to the moon in 1969, why haven't we been back in decades? Priorities shifted, budgets were cut. Despite calm answers, the doubts remain. And that tells us something important. So were the moon landings faked, or were they simply misunderstood? Distorted by the lens of mistrust. We may never convince everyone, but for now, the evidence remains grounded. Not in fantasy, but in science. In the next chapter, we'll look at why we want to believe in the illusion, from psychological warfare and propaganda to the very human hunger for myths. Let's explore the why behind the doubt. Chapter 6. Psychological Operations. A Cold War Illusion. The year was 1969. The world watched with bated breath. A man stepped onto an alien world, and for a moment, just a moment, humanity felt united under a single flag. A footprint and a fragile dream, but beneath that moment of awe, in military terms, it's the use of planned strategies to influence emotions, motives, and objective reasoning, typically targeting foreign populations, but peace ops aren't always about deception. A quieter question still lingers. Was it also a message? To some, Apollo 11 was just that. A master stroke of national storytelling. A flawless global performance. Every movement of Apollo 11 was televised, narrated, and reinforced by trusted anchors and familiar voices. Leaking false stories, confusing facts, and spreading rumors were part of the intelligence playbook. So perhaps it's no surprise that even the moon landing hoax theory itself has been described by some historians as a counter, possibly seeded by Soviet disinformation campaigns. The moon landing, whether authentic or orchestrated, became more than just a moment in history. Let's continue walking together, gently, into the twilight between memory and mystery. It became a myth. A modern legend that shaped how a generation saw itself. And that's the power of imagery. That's the echo of strategy. Whether we believe it or not, we remember it. So, was the moon landing a psychological operation? If it was, it may have been the most beautiful one ever staged. A symbol of peace cast in shadows. A story that made the world look up and wonder if trust in NASA could be undermined, if Americans began to doubt their own government, then the Soviets might win a psychological battle without firing a shot. Ironically, some believe the very idea that the moon landing was fake was itself a weapon of Cold War propaganda. From Walter Cronkite's steady calm to the rehearsed confidence of astronauts in interviews, the landing felt real because it was broadcast like a ritual. Some researchers argue the imagery was too perfect, the footage too cinematic, no failures, no fear, no hesitation, just a clean, noble victory, projected to 600 million people at once. Could that itself be a kind of PSYOP? Not to fake the landing, but to make it unquestionable. A symbol, a psychological operation, crafted not just to reach the moon, but to win a war of perception. This chapter explores the possibility that the moon landing, real or not, was used as the ultimate stage. Not just to impress, it gave people a sense of unity. A reason to believe again. Americans needed a win. And the world needed wonder. Whether by design or not, the moon landing was psychologically healing, a shared dream projected into the sky. But to influence, the Cold War was never just about bullets or bombs. It was a war of ideas, of ideals, and of global narrative control. The Soviet Union had reached space first, launching Sputnik in 1957 and Yuri Gagarin in 1960. The West, particularly the United States, needed a symbolic victory. One so grand it would shatter doubt and silence critics. Landing on the moon wasn't just a mission. It was a gesture of dominance, a proof of superiority, not just in technology, but in the power to inspire or manipulate. What is a psychological operation? Sometimes they're about demonstration, showcasing power in a way that leaves no room for challenge. The message, we are the future, we are the leaders, we are the ones who can leave Earth. And in a divided world, that was more powerful than any missile. Many forget that NASA, though civilian in appearance, had deep military roots. The early space race was born from rocket science. Technology that began with weapons and missile systems. Werner von Braun, the architect of the Saturn V rocket, had built V-2 rockets for Nazi Germany during World War II. Later, under Operation Paperclip, he and other German scientists were brought to the United States to lead America's rocket development. And throughout Apollo's development, Department of Defense contractors and classified technologies were involved. Even the tracking and telemetry systems used during the missions were tightly integrated with military networks. To some, this web of connections suggests a dual purpose: scientific achievement on the surface and strategic signaling underneath. In an age before the internet, television and print were the lifeblood of public perception. The US government understood this and invested heavily in media coordination. During the Cold War, both the US and the USSR practiced disinformation tactics. For a nation rocked by war, assassinations, and civil unrest, Apollo 11 was a bomb. Here's the quiet truth. Psychological operations don't need to be false to be effective. They only need to be memorable, symbolic, and emotionally resonant. In our next chapter, we'll explore how science, skepticism, and space dreams continue to evolve. Where does the truth begin? Where does it bend? Chapter 7. Eyewitnesses, Whistleblowers, and Silence. In the stillness of the moon's surface, there's one thing we never hear, a voice whispering from behind the curtain. In this chapter, we turn down the volume to listen closely to the words and silences. These names, like the moon itself, are etched into our collective memory. They were pilots, soldiers, engineers, not actors. They trained for years, risked their lives, and became national icons. But over the decades, some observers have noted something strange. When asked about their time on the moon, the astronauts often appear reserved, even uncomfortable. Clips allegedly show astronauts rehearsing movements on sets, with unusual lighting rigs and artificial backdrops. Surely, if something as vast as faking the moon landing had occurred, someone would have spoken out. And yet, no whistleblower has ever emerged with verifiable evidence of fabrication. Is that proof of authenticity? It was later proven to be a deep fake, an actor using Kubrick's likeness and voice, yet the video spread far and wide before it was debunked. Its popularity highlights a deeper truth. People want to believe in secrets, because secrets mean power. And stories of forbidden truth soothe the uneasy parts of our minds. Or does it point to strict compartmentalization? A structure where no single person saw the full picture? The reasons could be many. Fear of legal consequences, loyalty to country, or maybe personal doubt. Maybe I misunderstood. There simply was no secret to break. Some astronauts and engineers have answered every question with consistent confidence. Others have avoided them altogether. As the decades pass, those who were there are growing fewer. Their memories are fading. Their records are archived. And the silence remains. Much like the Manhattan Project, which built the atomic bomb in secret. Massive Cold War operations were often designed on a need-to-know basis. Each worker saw only their sliver of the machine. And if anyone did suspect deception, would they dare risk reputation, career, or life to say so. But the timing in the minds of conspiracy theorists is too coincidental. One of the most cited examples is Thomas Ronald Barron, a NASA safety inspector, who compiled a 500-page report criticizing practices at Cape Kennedy. Shortly after testifying before Congress, he, his wife, and daughter died in a train accident. His report vanished. Coincidence or silencing? There's no hard evidence, only whispers. After all, you don't go to the moon without rehearsing every single step on Earth first. Still, some suggest the distinction between training and staging may have been blurred intentionally or otherwise. Could the simulations have been used to create fallback footage? Or perhaps even shown to the public under pressure when real transmissions failed or were too poor to broadcast? It's not proof, but it is unsettling. Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, became intensely private, rarely giving interviews, often declining to speak publicly at all. Of those who were there, the astronauts, engineers, insiders, and quiet skeptics, and to ask gently, if the moon landings weren't what we were told, who knew? And if they knew, why didn't they speak? Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. Buzz Aldrin, though more visible, has had volatile reactions to conspiracy questions, including once punching a moon hoax proponent in the face. Michael Collins, who orbited above while the others walked, wrote beautifully about the loneliness of space, yet seemed detached from the moon experience itself. Of course, personalities vary. Not everyone seeks the spotlight, but some researchers wonder, why the unease? If you walked on another world, wouldn't you talk about it endlessly? Or would you carry something heavier than memory? They sit quietly, visibly tense, avoiding eye contact. The atmosphere feels more like a courtroom than a celebration. Skeptics interpret this as a sign of guilt, or even psychological strain from maintaining a secret, but others say it was simply the weight of fame, pressure, and the constant media cycle that followed them for decades. Still, when you slow it all down, when you listen not just to their words, but their silences, it raises questions that don't easily fade away. One of the most frequently referenced pieces of evidence by moon hoax theorists comes from a 1991 NASA anniversary press conference featuring Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. One of the more controversial claims made by skeptics involves supposed training footage that they say was passed off as real moon landing video. The Apollo program employed over 400,000 people, from engineers to janitors, from Houston to Cape Canaveral. Over the years, certain names have been connected to strange incidents and tragic accidents. Engineers or commentators who reportedly had questions about the Apollo program. A controversial video circulated online in the 2010s, purporting to show legendary filmmaker Stanley Kubrick admitting he helped fake the moon landing footage. So, if there were secrets behind the moon landings, why didn't someone break the silence? The belief that the ends justified the means, or perhaps, in the end, silence can mean many things. Shame, duty, peace, or simply no story to tell. Chapter 8. What we left on the moon, in the hush of deep space, where Earth is only a pale blue sphere, something remains behind. On the lunar surface, silent, untouched for over half a century, sit the quiet relics of an era, not monuments of stone or brass, but tools, footprints, and fragile traces of humanity's boldest claim. In this chapter, we gently step back onto that dusty terrain, not to ask what was said, but what was left, because even after the rockets fell silent, evidence remained. Or did it? When astronauts departed the moon, they didn't take everything home. Skeptics argue, could these be meteorites collected on Earth? Or samples faked in secret NASA labs? The rocks are real, but is their origin? They left behind more than just footprints and flags. Some of these items were intentional. Scientific experiments meant to operate for weeks, even years, in the lunar environment. The compositions too artful, as though arranged on a sound stage. In truth, other nations were watching. During the Apollo missions, independent observatories and foreign governments tracked the spacecraft. The Soviet Union, NASA's Cold War rival, had every reason to challenge a deception. Even with rocks, reflectors, and remnant machines on the moon, some believe the deception could run deep. Perhaps the landings were partial. Real missions with parts staged for TV. There are discarded rover wheels, footprints that will remain undisturbed for millions of years, but we can look up and wonder, not just what was left, but what remains in us. Curiosity, skepticism. As the moon drifts slowly across our night sky, its surface still holds the artifacts of our greatest triumph, or our greatest illusion. Which one you believe may not change the moon, but it may change how you dream beneath it. There is a plaque on the lunar module's ladder that reads, "We came in peace for all mankind." Or perhaps the first steps were faked, with real missions following later. Or maybe the lie isn't about the moon at all. Maybe the lie is in us, in how we process truth, doubt, and the limits of trust. They had their own tracking stations, their own intelligence, yet they never disputed the landings, at least not officially. Others counter. In the vacuum of space, with no atmosphere to scatter light, shadows behave differently. The astronauts were trained photographers, after all, and many of the most famous photos were taken with fixed cameras mounted to their chests. Are they beautiful because they were staged, or because even on the moon there is beauty? They document tools, equipment, and even discarded gear lying in the lunar dust. Placed during Apollo 11 and later missions, this mirrored device reflects laser beams fired from Earth observatories. Even the path left by astronauts, skeptics argue the resolution is too low, that shadows and artifacts could be misread or misunderstood. But for many scientists, the third-party confirmations add one more layer of consistency. To this day, scientists bounce lasers off it to measure the exact distance between Earth and the moon. Accurate to within millimeters, Apollo astronauts brought back 382 kilograms of moon samples. Rocks, soil, and dust. Collected from multiple locations across 6 separate missions, scientists around the world, including those from countries with no connection to NASA, have studied them. That's no legend, no photograph. It's an ongoing, measurable interaction. Something is reflecting that beam. Is it a coincidence, or is it undeniable? One of the most famous, the Lunar Laser Ranging Retroreflector. Apollo 12, 14, 15, and 16 missions deployed passive seismometers, devices designed to detect moonquakes. Some were even triggered deliberately using discarded parts that were allowed to crash back onto the surface. 4 years, data streamed in. There were also solar wind collectors, designed to gather particles from the sun, bringing back data on cosmic radiation and space weather. These weren't grand gestures for the cameras. They were quiet instruments of science, subtle, precise, and methodical. And yet, for those who doubt the landings, they raise another question. Could such experiments have been faked? Perhaps the most cited physical proof of the moon missions comes in the form of lunar rocks, solar wind and weird isotopic ratios. Some still doubt them. They're different from Earth rocks. No moisture, micrometeorite impacts left on the moon were not only instruments and samples, but images. Thousands of high-resolution photographs, 16mm films, telemetry tapes. But these, too, have drawn criticism. Some say the lighting is too clean, the shadows too inconsistent. Could the entire world be fooled? Did only the United States ever see these events? Japan's Seleni orbiter and India's Chandrayaan missions have since photographed Apollo landing sites from orbit. Tiny flags, shadows. Could it all be a lie? That is the question that has never fully gone away. What the moon still holds. There are 5 American flags on the moon. Most have long since turned white from solar radiation. No cameras rolling, no audience. Just a message left. In silence, we may never walk there ourselves. Chapter 9. What the moon landing means to us. The moon has always been with us, long before rockets, before telescopes or calendars, before we knew what it was made of. We watched it wax and wane, pull the tides, and light our night skies. But in our very sense of what was possible, it was not just a celestial body. It was a mirror of our imagination. When, in 1969, the announcement echoed through the world, "The Eagle has landed," something shifted. Not just in science or politics. There was fear, distrust, division, and yet, for a few brief hours, 600 million people across the globe looked up, not at each other. For once, the broadcast didn't divide us, it united us. In wonder, it gave us a moment, true or mythic, that pointed not to conflict, but to the stars. Why we need to believe human beings are meaning makers is something worth holding on to. Even now, especially now, as you lie in the stillness of night, the moon watches, quiet, timeless. Whatever your truth, it waits for no one, but it welcomes your wonder. We don't just want facts, we want stories. The moon landing, in its purest form, is the ultimate story. Man defies gravity, overcomes danger, steps into the void and returns with knowledge. The Apollo program, for all its machinery and calculations, was never just about engineering. It was about hope, about proving that, with enough effort, we could transcend our limits. It's a modern myth, not because it's false, but due to the feelings it stirs. It speaks to who we want to be. As a species, bold, curious, capable of peace amid conflict, truth, memory, and the moon. Time moves on. The astronauts grow older. Some have passed away. The tapes degrade. The flags bleach in solar wind. But the story remains. In museums, in textbooks, in bedtime stories, in quiet documentaries like this one, whispered while the world sleeps. It's about possibility. It tells us that limits can be broken, that with enough courage, planning, and belief, we can move beyond what we thought was real. And yet, not everyone accepts the story as told. Skepticism is not always cynicism. Sometimes it is born from a deeper wound. Disappointment in institutions, knowing that the truth can be twisted and sold, right? For those who question the moon landing, the doubt is often not about rocks or rockets. It's about trust. When Neil Armstrong descended that final step, he didn't just touch down on lunar soil. He landed in our collective consciousness. Consider the world in 1969. The Cold War simmered. Vietnam raged. Civil rights movements fought against centuries of injustice. Too many believing in the moon landing is not just about patriotism or science. Perhaps, in the end, the moon landing lives in a space between certainty and wonder. We may never all agree on the moon landing's every detail, but we can agree that it changed us. And maybe what matters most is not whether we landed on the moon, but whether we believed it was possible at all. That feeling we all share, it's truly amazing. And sometimes wonder is enough. And so our journey draws to a close. Across these quiet hours, we've walked through history and memory, between rockets and rumors, between facts we know and stories we still puzzle over. We've explored the machinery and the mystery, the science and the skepticism, the politics, the psychology and the poetry, proof of what we can do when we dream big, plan carefully, and refuse to accept the sky as our limit. Some believe without doubt. Too many, the moon landing is one of humanity's proudest moments. It's the triumph of reason and courage, of metal and math, of faith in something larger than ourselves. The kind of story that lifts spirits and ignites futures. Some still wonder, but not everyone sees it that way. For others, the moon landing is something more unclear, a symbol of trust lost or truth obscured, a case study in belief, not in what happened, but in how we decide what is real. Some ask, was it a cinematic illusion, a Cold War performance, a well-timed spectacle to steer a weary world? And some simply ask, why are we still asking? The space between wherever you land, between those questions, what's undeniable is this: the moon landing, true, false, or somewhere in between, has become more than an event. It reflects our values, our fears, our longings. It shows how far we'll go to reach the stars, and how far we'll reach just to understand ourselves. Let your thoughts settle gently, like lunar dust under low gravity. Let go of the need to solve it all. Some truths are soft, like moonlight itself, not there to be held, just felt. It is a cultural mirror, a story that still glows. Maybe that's why this story still matters, not just for its heroes and their suits, or the footage and the footprints, but for what it does to us when we look up at the moon and wonder. Whether you see a landing site or a silver mystery, a proud flag or an empty stage, the feeling it stirs is real. Wonder doesn't depend on certainty. So now, as the world quiets and the night deepens, let this story drift into your dreams. Breathe deeply. Close your eyes. Somewhere above, the moon continues its orbit. Silent, ancient, watching, and maybe that's all it's ever needed to do. Thank you for joining this journey through time and thought. Rest well now, and let your curiosity float gently among the stars.